early 2000s. There we go. And specifically, I know I was a pretty active user from April 18th, 2002 to July 7th, 2007. How do I know that? Because like a totally normal person, I saved every one of those conversations and still have them to this day. Did anyone else install that hacky AIM Plus plugin that let you do this? Okay, well, we got one person, cool.
Also, I'm very
So I was watching, some highbrow television the other night, and don't remember what it was exactly, but this thought struck me of, what if I could make a bot out of all of those conversations that I've saved all these years? Could I make it sound just like the real me, which is Igglebop? So yeah, all those files, they were just stored in HTML. So cool, I know how to parse HTML. I'm a Python data kind of guy. So let's just pop open one of those files. Look at that beauty. Early 2000s, so we got all caps, inline styles all over the place. You guys notice all of those body opening tags with no closing body tags? So yeah, in Python, my go-to for web scraping would be Beautiful Soup. Tried a couple other different libraries, and nothing could handle this. So I just went to regex. Imagine a data cleansing montage here. Lots of regex, lots of trial and error. Of course, they changed the format over the years. So I parse half of them, then I have to change the method. And then there's that battle between, I should really write unit tests for this and start to firm this up. And then no, I should just keep on coding and get this damn thing done. It's never easy to make those decisions. But after enough time of wrangling this, I got the whole database parsed out, 250,000 messages. I want to talk for a minute about these conversation IDs because this was kind of fun to think through. In my initial parsing, I had each message was tagged with the from and the to. So I'm talking to you, and then you're talking to me. The problem is once you sort those, you get all of me up in one group and then all of you in a different group. So I started to think about what defines a conversation. Well, you need to keep those parties stable. There's the me side of it, and then there's the other side of it. And the thing that's hopping back and forth is the speaker. So that's, I got the me, the other, and the from. And then from there, I was able to define independent conversations, that a conversation changes whenever, a conversation is stable as long as the me is stable, the other is stable, and it's been less than 30 minutes since the last message or so. So from that, I was able to parse out these 250,000 messages into something like 20,000 different conversations, maybe more. All right, so then I got to the bot, and I used GPT-2, which is just widely available. It's a general language trained model. And then you can fine tune it on any particular data set to kind of give it the accent, if you will, of what that communication is like. I actually didn't have to write any code for this. I did use Python, and there was some environmental challenges, but I got through it. I'm happy to talk to anyone if you guys want to do this on your own. So once the environment was set up and I pointed it to my data set, I set it running. And this is pretty fun. It loads up the data. It starts these training loops. And then every 10 minutes or so, it spits out a set of samples. And it starts out pretty rough, but it gets more and more realistic over time. And that's pretty fun to watch. I have a GPU. Turns out it's not good enough. I thought it would be, but no. So I just CPU trained it. And that had the side benefit. It was slow, but it had the side benefit that my office was nice and warm the last few days. So let's just get into it and see some of the examples. A little bit, it helps to know a little bit about me at this point in time. I was playing a lot of music in bands. I was living in California. I went to school in San Diego. And otherwise, I'm just kind of this cynical, sarcastic, typical college kid. So the initial version of the bot, I trained on just my side of the conversation. And let's see some examples. It's gotta suck being in a really shitty place because if you go there, you're gonna die.
That's deep.
The reason I say we're just friends is because I know it won't be the last time I forget about you. And for a while now, it hasn't been. So of course I've cherry picked these. These are some of the more fun ones. It generated plenty of things that I might have realistically said, but what's the fun in that? Yeah, it's the same thing with that song. It's about a bunch of people who are really struggling with their lives right now. I know, I think it's really beautiful. I don't know if it gets euphemisms, but this one's pretty funny. Oh yeah, you said she was good at laundry. Oh yeah, she's like my favorite brand of laundry. Hey, I'm really looking forward to having a party at Yahoo this weekend. I'm just going to take a shower, run to my friend's apartment, and go to the beach to soak up everyone's attention. So it was a lot of fun. It captures, like, there are some elements of me in these things, but the overall thread of the sentences is a little bit lost. And so with that, I thought, hey, let's challenge it some more and give it whole conversations between me and my friends. One thing I thought was funny, so some real usernames that go bop at the top, that was me, some of my friends. It started generating these fake usernames pretty early on. And I like that what it captured, like Chris the Nerd, like the leet speak there is pretty cool. Sighing a sigh, that's a great username. I wish that was mine. Cowgirl17, I thought this was a friend of mine when I was reading these, and I went looking, and it turns out she doesn't exist. So it did a pretty good job. Again, the first few hours of this training, it's not giving you much, and I'm just going to let you guys read these.
I mean, those are really conversations.
Oh, totally. 24 hours later, it's starting to make a little more sense. So it's sort of got to feel like a real conversation, but I don't know what it's trying to say here. So 36 hours later, we start to get topics and we start to get threads of these conversations. So Kill the Box is actually a former bandmate of mine. I talked a lot to him about music. Also, by this point, it's only giving me real usernames from the data set. So you could say that maybe it overfit on that stuff, but the conversations are still made up. Two drummers and make a keyboard player. Yeah, that makes a cool idea. And then it gets more serious with relationships. Yeah, I'm not much for those folks who are out of my league. All right, that's all those examples. So I promised a chatbot. I did do an iteration where I tried to make a chatbot. The strategy was a little different here. I was just going off tutorials for this stuff. It wasn't too terrible. I used Microsoft's Dialogue GPT, which is GPT-2, but trained on this massive Reddit thread. So it's a little bit more dialogue back and forth oriented. Also, I couldn't figure out how to get the CPU training to work. I needed a GPU, so I used Google Cloud, which was new to me, maybe familiar to you guys, but lets you use cloud resources for this stuff. Google very quickly said you're using way too many resources and shut me down. But I managed to get a real quick conversation with me from 15 years ago. He ended like almost every conversation with just exclamation marks. Anyway, so that was some fun. In conclusion, what have I learned with this? Well, it was pretty funny. It's also a little exhausting, trying to read meaning into these conversations that weren't real, but sort of felt real and were with real people I interacted with. It definitely hit that sort of uncanny valley kind of feel where it's almost there, but not quite. I was using some of the smallest models on this, so you could definitely level up and get more real from there. It's also just a weird experience going back and reading like my life in detail back in these days. I mean, like many elements of my life were tracked in these conversations, and some of them were real gut punches of nostalgia. I'd forgotten things about that time. And, I think we often feel like we're constantly evolving toward better versions of our lives and better versions of ourselves. And it was weird to see how much of my present self was in this past. Some things that were in that life that are not in my life anymore, like music was such a big part. So maybe I've been spending too much time with this emo younger version of me. But I thought hold on, woo, sorry. Giving away the end. I started to wonder, like, maybe we're not constantly evolving into better versions. Maybe we're just tumbling forward and then forgetting the past. And maybe that's a good thing. So after spending this week of reviving my life from 15 years ago, I think I'm going to put this project on the shelf. But one thing I wanted to still bring forward and leave with you guys was, do you guys remember the buddy info? So buddy info was where you could it was your about me. You could just write something and, people would just be constantly writing like song lyrics or, whatever deeply philosophical thing they wanted to share with you. And you could right click and check their buddy info. So I've had these song lyrics in my head from Death Cab for Cutie, and I just wanted to show what a deeply philosophical person I am and leave you guys with that. So thank you. And if you guys have any questions, I'm here.
No questions from online yet, but Robert had a fun fact that AOL chat servers supported about 60,000 connections per server.
Wow.
That a dedicated engineer who rewrote the network interface card forever.
Wow.
It's very stuff back then.
Yeah. Cool.
So yeah, that's it. Fun facts.
I had some conversations from when Facebook was just coming out that I reread.
All right, 1 second. We'll get the next one up.
Doesn't seem to like my camera.
That's okay. I mean, main thing is the mic and then sharing your screen.
Cool.
And then,
Sure.
does it look like you're connected to the screen?
No.
But mine was connecting, but it wasn't displaying either.
Yeah, mine doesn't even seem to be pending anything is happening.
Great thing here, right?
I don't know what buttons to hit or not to hit.
Do you have your display up? Yeah, it's not showing up yet.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Did I kick something? There's
I
a.
don't know. It's just, like that's.
Oh, something just maybe. Oh,
There we go.
There we go.
Yeah, I think it's this Ethernet connector down here.
It's a really bad location. For
It
that.
is. Cool.
No, we're good. I just closed the display window.
Yep. Share.
Screen. Should tires. Yes.
Duplicate.
What's happening?
Is your screen set to mirror?
No. Should probably do that, shouldn't I?
Go to arrangement.
Thank you.
There we go.
Am I sharing the correct screen now?
We're sharing that one.
Cool. What's fine? Presenter view. Okay.
Can see his shadow.
Cool. So
Lovely. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Quinn, good to see you, man. Didn't expect to see you here. I just moved to Bend recently, and Kyle was like, hey, we got more speaking slots. And I was like, well, I guess I'll make something up. This is a topic. I work for WP Engine currently as a solutions architect. So I spend a lot of time thinking about headless WordPress, and rendering patterns is one of those things I've been thinking about a lot lately. So I don't know, maybe everyone knows these things. Maybe I'm just behind the curve, but I thought I'd share. So I'm really curious, who wants to throw out a definition for render? All right, we're talking about rendering patterns. What do we mean by render here? Anyone? It's all right.
show stuff.
I'll go with mine here. A website is rendered when the HTML content is finalized, right? So we can talk about CSS and how you get that, and how you get your JavaScript and bundlers or just straight. But at the end of the day, like the browser needs HTML. And that's like the structure and the basis of our website. So from here on out, at least, when I talk about rendering, we're not talking about what's happening in the browser and in the DOM. We're just talking about the HTML content that's getting delivered to that DOM. So what are the rendering patterns? Well, historically, we've got a couple. The OG of rendering patterns is you typing in a text editor some HTML. And then we added this thing called server-side rendering, right? ASPX.NET came along, PHP. We had a server now doing the work for us. We could build templates. Then we got static site generation. Not really sure what the first static site generator was, but I'm sure it's still around probably. Modern examples would be like Eleventy, Hugo, Jekyll, these kinds of things. And then we got a client-side rendering, which I specifically didn't choose a single page app here because I think single page app is a subset of this. That's an example of client-side rendering where you got a whole app like React managing your DOM. But at the same time, if you fetch some JSON and render HTML from that JSON data, that could just be pure JavaScript, no React, no fancy things, and that's adding HTML to the DOM on the client side. It's client-side rendering. So from here on out, author time rendering is the only one of these things that is really human rendering. The rest are all done by computational resources. So we're going to ignore that author time for the rest of this. So not to pick on PHP too much, but I think JavaScript is kind of better than all other programming languages when it comes to the web. And it's not for any of the typical reasons, right? I don't think...
Oh, no.
I didn't touch it this time.
Cloud's nightmare. So when we first turned it on, it had a warning about the filter, and I wonder if it's overheating.
Yeah, the link's working.
Ooh. Well, the slides aren't too important, so if Kyle's good with it, I'll just keep talking. I mean, the internet can probably still see my stuff. I'll just keep talking. All right, so it's not because,
So keep doing your slides because the internet can see this.
Yep.
If you guys ever want to look at the slides, they'll be online.
Cool. So it's not because PHP sucks. It's not because PHP is slow or slower. And it's not because, oh my God, PHP. It's really not. My reason is because PHP doesn't run in the browser or whatever other language you want to pick, right? There's only one language in this world at this point in time that can run in the browser and on a server, and that's JavaScript. So what does that enable? And I will add a caveat to that. WASM might change that one day, WebAssembly, but for now, that's not the case. So let's take a step back here and kind of see where we came from. So not long ago, if you wanted to choose to do server-side rendering or static rendering, whether you want to do that or whether you want to render something in the browser was determined by the programming language you choose, right? If you want to do server rendering, you choose PHP or something else, Go, Rust, whatever. You choose that language, and that language determines your ability whether you want to render in a client or on a server, whether that's build time server or runtime server. More recently, though, because of JavaScript's ability to run both on client and server, that decision got moved down to the framework level, right? No longer did your choice of framework or language determine whether you could do a server render or a client render or a build time render. Your choice of framework did that. And this is where we get into something called hybrid rendering, right? Because JavaScript can move back and forth, we now have the ability, hey, we're back. We no longer are stuck to writing a piece of code and that only rendering on a server or only rendering in the client. The framework and the tools it provides can say, hey, I'm going to render this in the server now, but I can use something like hydration in React or Vue to now run that also in the server or on the client side. A good example of that, right? Back in the early days of Gatsby and Next, I live in React world, so those are going to be my examples most of the time. If you wanted to do server-side rendering, you chose Next, and if you wanted to do static rendering, you use Gatsby. They also both had client-side rendering aspects to them, right? So they're doing this hybrid rendering model. Now, as time has gone on, Next adopted static rendering patterns, and Gatsby even really recently just introduced SSR. So now you don't really have to choose, like I can choose any framework based on my experience, based on what my company tells me to use, and I can now choose the correct rendering pattern for this content based on the route, which is great. And in the future, I hope, and at least React is working on making that down to the component level. You guys might have heard of something called React server components. And this is basically the idea of saying this component can only be rendered on the server. So that the JavaScript and everything related to that builds that final HTML never gets shipped to the browser, which is great for users and shipping less JavaScript to the browser. So slowly we're getting more and more granular with all these things. So yeah, hybrid rendering, we've been talking about, it's kind of enabled some of this stuff. I think the really important thing to think about here with hybrid rendering is portability. back when people used to talk about portability in React, I always heard, oh, I can use this on React Native, right? I can build a mobile app and I can build a website, which is true, but how many people have ever actually done that? I know I haven't. And every time I've talked to people that have done it, they're like, this is a terrible idea. Don't use the same components. So even if it's possible, it might be limited to like large enterprises that have time and energy to do that. But really, more importantly, what it enables is what we've just been talking about, right? It enables people and the developers to say, hey, this route, this website, like I can use all the same tooling or this component even, right? And I can say, this needs to be static content because this is my marketing site. And I can use the same application and have client-side rendered or server-side rendering for the actual application that I'm selling my customers. And once you make that choice, you're not stuck with it. You have the flexibility to go back and change that and learn that SPAs aren't a great way to ship marketing sites. So we defined rendering earlier. So before we go on, let's define rendering pattern. This is a little context on this right here. This is really what got me thinking on this. So I was having an argument on the internet like any good software developer. We were Gatsby, when they were working on the release of their SSR and their DSG stuff, which I'll get into in a second, they brought in a bunch of us that were part of the community, said, hey, we're going to tell you about this stuff. You can't tell anyone else, but we want your feedback. And I was arguing over the definition of what they were calling at the time deferred static rendering. And I was like, it's a runtime server, and you're rendering on that runtime server. So this is just SSR. Why don't we just call it SSR? And they were correctly calling it something else because I was being naive and silly. And finally, they said something that made me realize I was focusing on location, right? Does it happen on a build server? Does it happen on a runtime server? Or does it happen in the client's browser? And because it was happening on a runtime server, I was calling it SSR. And they were saying, look, that's great. But SSR has an inherent connection between a runtime server and the fact that it happens every time someone sends an HTTP request to that server. Those two things together make us a traditional server-side rendering. So if the event that triggers that render is no longer an HTTP request or no longer triggering that code to run on every HTTP request, that's no longer server-side rendering, at least as we traditionally think about it. SSG would be a build time server plus usually it's a webhook, right? And that webhook could come from a GitHub repository, or it could come from like your CMS of choice to say, hey, rebuild this site. So now that we're thinking of rendering not in just the location aspect, we can talk about it as a location plus an event. And this work is actually already being done. Next came out with their incremental static regeneration. Quick overview of this, it's basically like a stale while revalidate cache. So it's happening on the runtime server, and the first HTTP request to hit that server does render the page, but everything after that is served from the cache, and based on a timeout, which is your event, that invalidates the cache and thus ultimately triggers a rebuild of that page. So Gatsby's deferred static generation, this is based a lot on their Gatsby data layer. And again, the initial request triggers a build, but from there on out, it serves the request. And even that build is actually atomic. So whereas ISR is not atomic, you can get new data every time it builds. You actually have to do a proper build in Gatsby to get new data out of your data system before that DSG rendering will actually create anything different. So it's kind of a combination of events. Netlify is doing their distributed persistent rendering that they're working on, which is basically, unlike the first two, which are framework specific, this moves it up to the platform level and says, hey, tell us what 10 routes of your 3,000 or however many you want to render to start at build time. And the rest of those, when they're requested, we'll render them. But from there on out, they'll be served from that cache. So these are really, I think, pretty basic, like playing with that event idea. But I think it's a really good way to think about like, oh, there's this other aspect that I personally had never thought about of like, there's an event that triggers this. what is that event? It could really be anything. In the case of any kind of client-side rendering, it could be a button click, it could be time-based, it could be a subscription coming in from your GraphQL or whatever kind of events. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where these kinds of things go into the future, and how we kind of play with what events and what locations render our websites. So what does this mean? I think this is a win for performance because we can have choice and we can optimize. If we decide we don't like how our website's currently rendering, we no longer have to convince our boss to let us rebuild the entire website in the latest and greatest JavaScript frameworks. We can just be like, well, I'll switch this to server-side rendering, I'll switch this to static, and we're off to the races. And because of that, developers win, and ultimately, I think users win. That hopefully we're shipping less code, right? The Svelte community is doing a lot of cool work in this space around how SvelteKit is enabling shipping an SPA, but you can even say in like per route basis, don't ship any of the actual SPA, like just ship the HTML and CSS. I don't want any JavaScript interactivity. Or if they come to this route from the SPA, do a client-side render. But if they come at it from anywhere else on the internet, just do a normal server render. It's really cool and interesting stuff that enables us to ship up JavaScript, which is always good. So yeah, that's rendering patterns. So thanks.
Can you provide like the pros and cons of like server side versus static versus client side? Because the trade-offs for me sometimes get confusing.
Yeah. So static, anything where your content is long-lived and it isn't unique to a specific person, that's really valuable. Obviously, SEO is a huge win there. So even if it isn't long-lived and you're worried about SEO, you kind of have to pre-render or statically build that. A server-side render would qualify too for that one, though. SSR enables, obviously, or CSR will enable any kind of authentication patterns where it's user-specific data that only they're ever going to see. So those are big there. Client versus server there kind of depends on, again, what the data looks like. If it's pure authentication and it's the same data, you just have to be authenticated to see it. Server side can have some benefits because you can cache more at that like application level. Whereas if you have a page that's mostly static, like public static content, but like they're logged in, so you got to show their name on the top side. Like, why would you make your server re-render that entire page just to add their name to it when you could just add their name with a client-side render and have everything else statically generated or at least highly cached? So it's highly dependent, but yeah.
So kind of like performance to dynamic is kind of the spectrum then for those choices. In a way. Sorry, I might be opening it up.
Yeah, it's a little bit like dynamism is always going to add like complexity, which is always going to slow you down a little bit. But it's more of like, where's the caching layer? And that affects performance, but you can still like what's best. Yeah.
Thank you. So that kind of goes into what I was going to ask is, so they haven't figured out server render components yet.
Yeah.
React's working on that, but can you do it the opposite way where you have a server rendered like React page through Next, but then dynamic re-renders within the page? So like certain content can be dynamic and client-side render?
Yeah. So that's pretty common. So I think I took that slide out, but like that's Gatsby's and Next current model, right? Is to pre-render, Next traditionally SSRs everything, and Gatsby traditionally statically renders everything. But the entire like single page app is still shipped. So you can make sure like you can not fetch certain data during build time. And then it happens on the client side. Or you can, if you invalidate your cache on like your GraphQL client or whatever, after 5 minutes, it'll refetch that data client side. So you're not stuck to that server side data. Yeah.
Chris Coyer says between the previous and two previous, which was the kind of next version between Netlify, Gatsby,
Yeah.
Next. They seem so barely different. I mean, in your opinion, what is the big difference besides like the little technical
Yeah, so
and what is just if you're trying to decide between these three and you want that like new rendering pattern, like what is the big
because all these three are very similar. So next is going to be time-based cache invalidation, which is simple, but until you need it to invalidate faster. And it's non-atomic, right? So every time that cache is invalidated, it's going to refetch data from the API, which might be a good thing and it might be a bad thing. And which also means you can do what's called like fallback routes. So if a route didn't exist at the time you published that new route will just effectively server-side render, and like you'll get a little spinner and then it'll render for the first person that hits it, which is nice, right? So you can add new posts to your blog or whatever, and you never actually have to ship a new build, like a traditional thing of builds of your next app, right? It'll just start rendering that in the ISR functionality. Whereas Gatsby, they specifically said, hey, we believe that like one of the huge benefits of the Jamstack is atomic builds, where that like your data can't change underneath and like mess with your application. So at build time, they fetch all the data into their data layer, and then anything that's rendered after that and later, you can't add new routes, and that data can't change. To actually get that data to update in your application, you have to do a new build. It's just deferring the rendering of the HTML and the page data.json file till someone actually hits it. So it's a reduction of time in how long it takes to build your website. Netlify DPR, I'm not as familiar with it. I don't think it can be atomic because they don't have control over the data layer like Gatsby does. So yeah, the nice part about Gatsby is there's no time base there, right? It's hey, my CMS told me my data changed, so we'll do a new build. You can instantly invalidate caches. Yeah. Great.
I'm going to challenge your position on JS supremacy here a little. What do you think of the Phoenix Live View? Like, where does that slot into?
I have no idea what that even is.
It's stateful server streaming HTML diffs over a website. So basically, it's the islands approach that is common with a standard Next site where you're doing partial hydration. But it's all of the re-rendering of your live dynamic content is happening on the server next to the database, and then only the HTML div is being streamed to the client.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that was what you call a hot take, right? It's not right. It's just a thing. Yeah, that's interesting. I've never heard of that. I mean, the approach I understand. Like, I'm not familiar with Phoenix in specific. Again, my point was, if you write code in whatever language that is, you're never going to be able to run that in a browser. You're going to have to run. Maybe you don't need that in that context, and that's a benefit. Like, you don't need to write JavaScript necessarily if you can do this cool streaming thing. But my point was just like JavaScript, at least for now, is the only language that we can run in all three of these locations without rewriting components.
Yeah, it's also where Rails is headed, at least as far as like if you're familiar with the A.com email service, they kind of pioneered this.
Yeah.
But they're trying to do a similar thing, which is you write all of your code, including the code that quote unquote runs on the client in your server-side language, and then you just stream the HTML diffs.
Yeah, interesting. Super interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that. I'll have to look more into it. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
So it looks like our other presenter, Mark, who's going to be talking about some Postgres stuff, is having some issues with his Postgres database locally. So he's going to be pushing off to our next event.
So Josh is going to be up next with our next kind of show and tell. Just kind of carrying on from what Chris did, I think last month. And then I'm going to open up to the floor. If anyone has an example of just like some show and tell that they want to do, they can grab my computer and come up and show something cool, walk us through something they're doing. Or, we can just kind of hang out and talk and, spend the rest of the time just, getting to know whoever's at your table and everything. But yeah, unfortunately, one of our presenters is not going to make it today. But yeah, we'll have him back during the new year.
All right, better?
Yes.
Okay. So this may take a little while to load. So ML5, so let's say you're interested in what our first presenter was talking about, building your own machine learning models, and you're good at JavaScript, but you don't know too much about machine learning. You want something interactive to get to know it. So this is something I did, or something that I used a couple of years ago when I was starting to get interested in it. So ML5, like TensorFlow.js. So the TensorFlow was, originally written in Python and was just on the server side. So you could parse all of your stuff on the server side, but it didn't help so much on the web side, right? If you wanted something interactive, like you could send text back and forth, but if you wanted to have something which actually manipulated images, for example, then there's something called TensorFlow.js, which allows you to do a lot of that, but you still need to know a lot of data science, basically. So ML5 was more like people who are into a couple of other languages, one of which was called processing. So processing came out, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago. And it can allow you to do some pretty neat graphics, but it is a different language, right? So it's kind of like Java. I think the second version of processing was written in Java. So it looks kind of like Java, like voids and things, but kind of similar to and it can have, pretty nice rendering here. Somewhat legible, but somewhat kind of mathy, right? So then at the ML, then there was something called P5, which came after that. So can anybody kind of guess, okay, what does this setup do, right? Okay. Take a guess. What's going to happen when I hit play?
Green square.
Yep, green square, light green, right? Okay. And then we'll skip the draw here. So they basically took some of the cool ideas in processing and then ported it over to JavaScript because they said, well, I want to learn this new processing language and I want to have it more like JavaScript. So this is more like JavaScript. Like there's let and constant, those are JavaScript. But there's special things that happen with this setup function or this mouse press. All right, so anybody want to guess what's going to happen when I press my mouse here? Draw a line, yep. And there's also these little circles. Where do the circles come from? Okay, this draw says So I draw a line, I grab my previous X and Y, I save that to global, even though globals are evil. And then you can make, a little square and things like that. Or a little stick figure, right? So, yeah, this is about the extent of my art skills. My wife's much better at art than I am. But okay, well, can we take this stick figure? Can we take a picture of me and overlay a stick figure like this? That shouldn't be too hard. Well, actually, it is hard. Up until a few years ago when machine learning got really popular, and then it became easy again. So like to just take a picture of my face and differentiate between my face and the background is actually pretty hard unless you have machine learning helping you out. So I'm gonna, by now, all right, let's see if CodePen's working today. Yes, it is. Okay. So it might not work. Oh, it does work. Okay. It's just my screen settings are too off. So let's try the full page view. Oh, and it's dark. Hold on. Let's try this. Okay. So if you look, you can see a little line going around here, right? So that little oval is something that I calculated. And here's another thing I calculated. Okay, there's my nose. Actually, it's not the nose. It's the middle of my face, right? And then if I look a direction, I've got X-ray eyes, right? Look down, look up, look around, right, left. Okay. So how did I do that? Was that a lot of code? No, I will turn that off, and we'll go to the editor view. Yeah. And then I'll probably have to disable this when I show you a few more examples, and then we'll be done. So this is,
Shout out to CodePen.
yeah, CodePen is awesome. As you can see, CodePen is much better than the P5 editors, which we'll also look at. And you can do anything here. So this is the ML5 JavaScript, right? So this setup has a special thing. This is the size of that image, and a bunch of other things. I won't go too much detail what I did here. One thing I did is if you press the mouse, it'll dump, while I was debugging this. And this is not production level code, I would say, but just something for fun. So yeah, I think if we click on here, we should get a dump of all the coordinates. So all of these coordinates are being calculated on the fly, and they're not being calculated back end on a server. There's no server for this. This is all within a machine learning library on the front end. And what these X and Y's are is this is something called PoseNet. So there's a probability that my nose is at this position. Like this is a 99%. It knows where my nose is, right? And it knows the X and Y score of that. And then my left eye, my right eye. And then there's also other probabilities of where it could be. So there's multiple things sent back. I think I clicked it a couple times. So this may be more than one payload worth of data. But what I do is I just grab the first one, the most likely one, right? And then what I do is I say, okay, I want to draw an ellipse, and I want to draw it based on where my ears are and a certain size. So I'm basically using the position of my ears to figure out an ellipse. And then from there, I also know where my nose is, so I can tell which way I'm looking by comparing my nose to that ellipse. And then that's how you can have the eyes shoot out. And it's just some kind of, and I did like developing this, I had to kind of like, okay, let me fill in an ellipse where my nose is and things like that, but I won't show you all that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable this or even close it, and show you some examples here, not here. in the examples. ML5 examples. So the ML5 is open source. I have contributed it because all the examples were broken when I first went to it. And I was like annoyed. So I figured out how to find the examples. And then I went and sent a pull request to fix that. And then they went and fixed some of the other ones. Although a few of the examples are still broken. So if you want to, contribute, you can find where the examples are in this code base and fix any broken examples you find. Like cartoon GAN, I think some of these are broken. But the one I used, I believe, was the face API. And hopefully this will work. This is an editor just for P5, not as good as CodePen, but it does work pretty well with this. And it might be too dark. Oh, there we go. Not too bad. So this is CodePen's example, P5's example, where it's not that much code. It's like 100 lines of code, right? And what it's doing is it's calculating on the fly from the browser, that image, where my face is, my eyebrows, eyes, nose, and mouth. And it's not 100%, right? It kind of flickers, probably because it's dark. If I turn on that extra light, it might do a little better. So we can try that. Yeah. So now it's more stable, right? And a little spookier. So there are, a few other interesting examples. That's the one I use. There's also one for the entire body where it's called PostNet. So it'll figure out where your hands are, where your head is, and where your feet are, right? So that'd be great, like if you wanted to learn Tai Chi or something like that, and you wanted to make it more interactive. And this is kind of what, Oculus does. So there's a Tai Chi thing. They just kind of calculate, they look at someone who's really good at that, they calculate where all the positions are, record it, and then compare you to that, right? What was one? Oh yeah, Face Mesh is also another one, which looks a little funky. Yeah, let's do the webcam version for that. But the cool things about this, I think, is that it's not that much code for the basic examples. It's going to get a lot more complicated as you play. And this one will probably take longer to load. So it's wrong. Okay. Interesting. Okay, maybe I need to get closer. No? So there are still bugs. And apparently.
There's still bugs that are presenting hardware too, so.
Yeah. But this is a face mesh. And maybe, is there a light here that we could turn on? We'll see if that one does it. This is just the HTML. And here's the sketch. No, it's still thinking I'm a giant face. Yeah. But it does have kind of like, what is it? Max headroom. I don't know if anybody remembers max headroom, but got that max headroom feel to it. Let me replay it and see. I'm wondering if it's getting just confused by this background. So we'll stop that. Yeah. I think they also have an example of that one. That's too bad because that one looked really cool when I was actually back home doing that one. But here's a static one, which will eventually load if I hit play. And yeah, so there's somebody's face with a face mesh over it. So anytime there's a webcam on, realize that, they do, in theory, you could get this much information from just a picture. Exactly where the eyes are, nose, and mouth. And basically it just goes through a bunch of key points. So it records all these key points. And it's all kind of machine learning. It does download a very large model. So there is some lag when you first start it up, which you've probably noticed. But then the actual amount of code here, I mean, it's 56 lines of code, right?
Maybe
No.
I should do-
I'm not presenting. Okay. Oh yeah. Can still hear me, but can't see the share. All right. So it could be that it was too much with sharing the video and having an interactive canvas. But anyway, so that's a 5-minute introduction to ML5. I would say like take a look at this before you look at TensorFlow, because TensorFlow is a bit more complicated if you're new to data science. But I think this is pretty approachable. It's not that much harder to learn than like processing, and you can do some pretty neat things just building off the examples, which is what I did with my example, which I've since closed. But you can find it on CodePen if you look for codepen.com/pressure19 for the little monkey and then oval face. And then we will close with that. But maybe we'll do the full page view. Yeah. So now the model's cached, so it's actually pretty fast. That's the other thing you'll find. And there's enough light that I can do my X-ray vision again. And look up, look down, yeah. So that's kind of fun. And so that was me just kind of like looking at these examples and building something with it afterwards. Any questions? Yes.
Can you feed it like video files?
You could, but you'd have to look into the documentation. I don't remember off the top of my head. Did we just crash again?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to finish up.
Set interval.
Yeah, I think probably what's happening is I'm overloading the computer, right?
Yeah, probably not yours.
Yeah.
Okay. Just saying. I feel like I could work all night.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, sorry for anybody on the stream who couldn't see me but could hear me. But this is what
I dropped the pen in the chat, so
okay.
we'll
Awesome.
post a link and say if anyone wants to have, laser beam shoot out their eyes.
Yep. And it will heat up your laptop. Like you could, if your hands are cold, you can just grab your laptop when one of these things are running, and it will heat it up because this is just looping, and it like every loop, every render, it's running it through this machine learning module. I have sometimes what you actually want to do is delay it, and this is a tip. If you do play with ML5, you might want to delay and say just re-render every half second or every 100 milliseconds, something where a human wouldn't notice it, but that's going to definitely, cause your CPU to get a little bit less hot. Because I think the first time it got really hot because I was doing this for like an hour or something, playing around with it. But yeah, that's it. So slightly more than 5-minute introduction to ML5.
Any other questions for Josh?
Anything else? No? Okay.
Does anybody have anything else they want to show and tell?
I can do a little lightning thing.
Yeah. What's your name?
Quinn.
Quinn. Are you on our selection?
I am.
Okay, this looks like we are good to go. All right, so this is a quick story about my last little side project where I wanted to go on a hike in Bend, and I wound up.
Can you share?
Oh, is it sharing the wrong thing? Oh, it's mirroring.
Sharing your other screen. So your presentation is the right screen online.
Yeah, let me get back to that Chrome window that was the sharing. StreamYard, Quinn, stop sharing, share screen. Okay. I'm selecting screen 1 here. Hello.
You could just mirror your displays. And you only have one screen.
I am. Oh,
Yeah,
I see what's going on.
You're extending it.
I thought that YouTube was what was getting the wrong thing, but cool. Okay. So let's get back to the topic.
And then share.
Is it not? Oh, I got to do it again.
Yep.
Okay, share screen.
That shit has to be so complicated.
Well, they just, for like privacy, they must reset it when you rearrange your displays. So, you guys have probably seen where this is going. So I moved to Bend somewhat recently. I really wanted to go hiking here, and they have this thing, which is, a generally pretty good idea on the surface, which is we're going to have permits for the hikes in Bend. And you go and you Google, how to go hiking in Bend, and you read through the like 4 different agency websites that have slightly different versions of instructions for how to access this thing. And you finally wind up on this lovely page. And you click through, which you can't do right now because everything's snowy and the road is closed. But you click through and you see that every single trailhead has been booked out 4 months in advance by very prepared vacationers. And so you also do a little bit more research and you realize that all of those fees from those very prepared vacationers are going to a defense contractor instead of land management agencies. And so what do you do at this point? You choose violence. And you go ahead and you decide to start scraping this website because, gosh darn it, some of these people are not going to get their kids into their station wagon this tourism season, and you would like to go hiking on their permit if they cancel it. And so you start, looking through your network inspector, and you start looking at some of the, HTTP requests for some of this stuff, and you're like, cool, it's just a JSON API, like we can do this, like we're just gonna scrape, like we'll scrape it, it's fine. This is fine. This is a normal way to go hiking in 2021. Like, this is reasonable. And so you start doing that and everything's going well until you get to the second page and it's a different format for the JSON. Everything has been rearranged slightly. Instead of division or campsite ID, it's now division ID. Instead of permit ID, it's now an alphanumeric string instead of, just an int. And okay, this is still fine. And then you realize that it actually varies not just based off of what trailhead you're on, whether it's a 7-day permit or a 4-month permit, it actually varies based off of the land management agency local office that is managing the resource. So a trailhead in the Deschutes National Forest is totally different from a trailhead in the Innu National Forest, which is actually using the campsites database on rec.gov. It's still fine, deep sigh. And then you go ahead and you dig your teeth in and you write a parser for every single one of those. So congratulations, you now have 7 parsers. I hope you documented all of them and tested all of them because the data will randomly change for the next season. You can be sure of that. They'll add a box on the form. And congratulations. So you now do the easy stuff. You write a backend, you write a notification system, you integrate with Twilio so that you can send, text messages when this stuff happens because it books out in like 5 minutes, even when a cancellation occurs. And you do this, and then you realize that they're sending you back bad data all the time. They'll randomly tell you that like 30 days of data is available. So deep sigh again, and you fix it. You don't trust anything. And if anyone tells you that you have more than your scan blip threshold, which is 15, you actually just hit the database again and again until it starts giving you consistent results. Which of course means that you have to implement some delay-based, rate limit avoidance and stuff like that. So obviously, hiking is supposed to be hard, right? Is what I'm getting from all of this. And we haven't even put the boots on yet. So you do all of this and you end up with a nice front end. And oh my God, you can go hiking. You've done all of the things that you need to do in 2021 to go hiking. And you can go hiking maybe on the day that you want if the Californian that has your permit decides to cancel it. And so there you go. You get to go hiking. That is the end of this lightning talk. What we can do about this, besides choosing violence, email the people who are in charge of this. Tell them it's not really that great, that it's really hard to access our local land management resources as people who live here and care about this land. Tell them that it's really not that great that the fees are going to Booz Allen Hamilton, a defense contractor, through this great public-private partnership, which is code for we didn't want to pay up front to build this website, so we let them do the Rumpelstiltskin thing. And then another thing we can do is get in touch with people, which I'm thinking about doing if they don't revise the permit system for next year, to collect data about usage. And our local land management agencies do not have insight into this system. It's not even owned and run by the government. So they have really limited analytics. And a third-party tool like this that was built to actually help them manage this and make good decisions that benefit the user groups that they represent could actually be really useful, as opposed to just something that lets me, cheat the system a little bit. Anyways, thanks for coming to my lightning talk. Questions?
So do you have it so it will automatically sign you up for those dates when
No, so that's kind of where I draw the line, and it's where their anti-spam prevention kicks in. So one of the interesting things about this being a federal website is they actually can't boot you without due process. So even if you look like a spam bot, act like a spam bot, all of that, they can't CAPTCHA you, they cannot restrict you from accessing this information without putting you through the federal judicial system, basically. The worst they can do is they can prevent your IP address from making too many requests in a 2-minute period or something, because it gets into malicious activity. But they can't permanently ban that IP address because they can't connect that IP address to a person and then sue that person, right? What they can do is they can force you to do a CAPTCHA before you enter into a contract with the government, which is what the permit reservation is. So you actually hit all of the anti-bot, anti-whatever, as soon as you start trying to make a reservation. Of course, there's plenty of people who have obviously gotten around that, but that wasn't in scope for this project because
that notify you as soon as something?
Yeah, it kicks you a text message and then a web notification as well.
Have you thought about just you obviously did this just for yourself and didn't really expect to get anything out of it. Have you thought about just trying to get this to the government? Just
Well,
do something
so this
better?
sort of exists in a more limited scope. This site is called Campflare. It kind of was born out of people's frustration with the same issue, which is worse in California, specifically with campsites in the California national parks. That is a full-on bot war zone. If you want to have a game day, red team style thing, try and get a campsite in Yosemite in prime season. You're competing with good engineers from Google and Facebook who wrote the anti-CAPTCHA software that they're defeating. that's like, if you really like want to take this up a step, you can read Adventure Journal has done some interesting reporting on this issue, like relative to the national parks thing. So this is kind of like me playing in the kiddie pool as far as like the Bend permit system goes. But this does exist for campgrounds only, in a couple of like free accessible forms that are just less efficient, slightly worse user interfaces, and lower temporal resolutions. You don't quite get like first in line.
Gotcha. Pretty cool.
But yeah, that was my summer project.
Welcome to bed.
Like got permits and then bailed, and then there isn't a cancellation function for the majority of the permits that are out there. So it's basically like you take it and then you bail, and then someone sees it right now. They were seeing like a 70% non-utilization rate or something like that. Wow. Yeah.
I did a much crappier version of that for non-natural last year.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. Like I said, I think this is probably the last live event for 2021, and we'll see you back next year. But we'll be online. If you have any ideas for what kind of events you want next year and how we can switch it up, we're all ears for figuring out something new. We have some ideas for more workshop style, doing some maybe hackathon type of thing. Whether we do that during the main events or have kind of like side events running in parallel, kind of like side workshops, little one-off things. Haven't really decided yet, but any ideas are welcome, and any ideas that you want to do for talks, love those as well. So hang out, drink your beers. I don't think there's any pizza left probably, but good to see everybody, and we'll see you in 2022.
Thanks for everything.
Yeah. All right, let's end the